Well, maybe I'll take it a bit broader, if I might, and go beyond the humanitarian sector for a minute to kind of look at what leadership means. Because, as you said, it's a thing that I worked on. I studied for a while, and one of the really weird things about it was that in studying leadership, it was very hard to actually get anyone who could explain what this thing was. What leadership actually is. Um, so there seems to be uh, a couple of different points of view. The first is that leadership is about what leaders do. It's kind of, the idea of leadership is about a leader, normally a kind of charismatic sort of individual who is able to bend the world into their, and circumstance and context, and to make difficult things happen. And it's kind of the heroic, super heroic idea of leadership. And a lot of people, I think, when we think about leadership, talk about leadership, are often talking about that sort of elements that exist within an individual, competencies and so on. And there's a lot of history behind that idea of what leadership is, and it's something which obviously has been pushed a lot by people in leadership positions, and people who on the front of Time magazine, and corporations who want to justify being able to pay top dollar to their CEOs and so on. So there's a lot of kind of history around that idea of the individual leader as the way we understand leadership. Um, Another way of thinking about leadership is kind of by thinking about it as the position. So it's not so much about this individual super person, as leadership is a property of the organization. And, it's something that if you're at the top of the organization, you are the leader, and you make things happen by the nature of the hierarchy. You're high enough up that you can pull all the levers, and then people, like in a machine, will kind of do what it is that you want. And so you've got this second idea, and often the two are conflated, but they are different. One is the idea of leadership as an individual property. One is the idea of leadership as a positional piece, about the organization. The really interesting thing when we looked at humanitarian leadership, though, is that kind of neither of these really work very well. The system and the crises and the complexity of responses is much too big for any individual however superhuman they are, to actually know what's going on and to handle. So there were real shortcomings with the idea of the leader, defining leadership, leadership being about kind of my personal abilities. The other thing, of course, and you know better than anyone else in the clusters, is that very few responses are done by one agency. And so, the idea of a sort of single hierarchy where you can tell people what to do also is not a model that works really well for the humanitarian system, because, even perhaps particularly, the HC is not really in a command and control position. There's not a single organization which they can sort of command. So neither of the existing models really worked when we were looking at humanitarian leadership. So we had to kind of take a couple of steps back and say, well, if it's not something which is about just being at the top, and if it's not something about all of the skills and abilities you have, because every time we looked at it, there were hundreds of lists of individual leadership competencies, and they almost had nothing in common. It depended which consultants had written it. And so we said, well, so what can we agree leadership is? And we came up with three things. More or less everyone agreed that their leadership is something about deciding where you need to get to, where you need the response to get to in a humanitarian context. What has to be different as a result of the response? Some people think of that as the vision. Kind of not sure about that, but we can think of it as the vision. The second thing was, how are you going to get there? So leadership was something about determining the strategy, how you'd use scarce resources to get to the vision. And then the third thing was making it happen. So you've got this where do we need to get to? How are we going to get there? And then the kind of management of the process of getting there, which often means rethinking the strategy because, of course, situations change. Those three things seem to be the basis of humanitarian leadership. And the really interesting thing is when you define leadership in that way, by what it achieves rather than how it's achieved, you see a whole load of other possibilities open up. And the one that we saw as being most successful in the humanitarian context was those three things are happening, but they're not all happening in the same place. They're not all happening at the top of the pyramid. A lot of those decisions are being made elsewhere in a network of organizations, and they're not all being done by one person. In fact, where things were most effective, the vision, the strategy, the implementation were often bubbling up from the varied and different activities of different organizations who, through their own experience on the ground, found themselves kind of trying to go in the same direction. So that's a long answer to a short question, but yeah, leadership is if we think about leadership as what it is meant to achieve, which is deciding what the humanitarian intervention is for and then making sure you get there, you suddenly see that leadership is being done much more broadly and by many more people than the traditional approach might make one think. Yeah, well, that's really interesting because, of course, the thing that I've just described as leadership is actually something that a lot of people would say, well, actually, what you're describing is coordination, isn't it? Leadership which is experienced across different organizations, and which is about bringing those organizations together in such a way that they're co-creating a direction and moving together. When you say that leadership is that, it looks a lot like coordination. You might say that leadership is more about what happens inside an organization. Coordination is more about what happens between them. You might say maybe leadership's more about where you have power and coordination's where you have influence. You might say that leadership is more about a single objective, trying to get to one very tightly defined place, and coordination is about a broader set of objectives. But basically, good humanitarian leadership is coordination. Good humanitarian leadership, from all of the evidence that we were able to come up about where it worked, where leadership worked, where you got good results, where you got to that vision, was often two things were happening. It was happening close. A lot of the decisions were being made close to the action, rather than, a long way away in headquarters or even in the capital. And the decisions were being made by groups of people. The vision was being set by groups of people. The strategy was being created by groups of people and not just by a single individual. So it starts to look a lot more like what a cluster is doing, albeit perhaps a little bit more decentralized than many of the clusters, more like sort of maybe a cluster plus area structure. It's going to be difficult, I think, to come up with, and maybe this is part of the challenge, of course, that our coordination approach has met. I mean, I think cluster coordination has been really effective, and because it's been effective, it's thrown up kind of more challenges. The further you move into something, the better you get at something, the more difficulties arise, and the more you kind of see all the stuff that you haven't got right. And I think that might be part of the challenge for the cluster, more broadly for the cluster approach. Now you have cash and you have diversity, really, really diverse contexts. And so I think it's hard to come up with a single pattern of leadership stroke coordination which is going to be effective from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. And that's, there's nothing new, I think, in saying that. But what are the common denominators of something that might work? I think the first the first thing is not so much about the clusters, it's about the organizations who are engaged, if you like, the formal humanitarian organizations, cluster partners, and lead agencies. We're not going backwards. Crises are going to get bigger and more complex and more frequent because of climate as well as other drivers. And so no single organization is going to have a monopoly on action. All action, 99.9% of action, is going to take place in an inter-organizational way with broad variety of different kinds of organizations. So I think that the first bit of that model is organizations which have really worked on and optimized being good partners, working well together. And that's not just a fluffy thing, it's not just, we're really nice. It's about establishing information management mechanisms which allow your information to be used easily by a variety of different organizations that you might link up with. It's about being really clear for those organizations about what they do and what they don't do, and not trying to kind of make up, oh, we'll do this because this is what's needed, but being very clear about the function of your particular organization, and if in a context you have a job to do there or not, in which case step back and let other people do it. It's being very clear about how you work so that you can be clear to partners what to expect from you, because one of the key elements of trust that we found is that trust doesn't necessarily come from having good or warm relationships. Trust comes from doing what people expect you to do. So to the degree you can be clear to partners that, you might not know us, but this is how we do it. And that makes it much easier to build trust. So part of the model is about organizations that have really thought about how do we play well together? How do we work well with others? Then from the other side, and this is where the clusters and the lead agencies, I think, might play a role, it's about thinking, so what do we do? Which, of course, what you do all the time, but thinking, what do we do to facilitate cluster partners and to work well with each other, but also to work well with a kaleidoscope of different sorts of organizations, civil society organizations, churches, mosques, football teams, local government. How do we create the conditions which allow these very quick creation of these very quick networks when they're required? And some of that, a lot of that is the bread and butter of the clusters. I think it's about common standards. It's much easier to work together where you have technical standards like the sphere standards. I think humanitarians have spent a lot of time focusing down on structures of coordination. But one thing that we've found is that structures are often less effective than just norms. You don't necessarily have to have an org structure if everyone's basically agreed that we're going to do things like this. So things like sphere standards and standards, or technical standards, the companion standards, I think, are very important. And again, information management, and this is an area where the clusters have done so much work, but still the system is really, really weak, I think, on information management. Just thinking about common approaches to understanding the kind of information that's needed and making that information, assessing that information, coding that information in such a way that it can be easily shared. So those would be some ideas, but basically coordination is going to be it's always been important. I do strongly believe it is the fulcrum on which future humanitarian action completely rests. That is a really, really difficult question. It's you guys, so I'm sure that you'll sort it out, because I don't have the answer. If there was one thing, I think, and again, it's by no means a smart or a new observation, but it would be this. It would be that for cluster partners, for humanitarian organizations, the core competency as well as WASH if wash is what your organization does, you need to be able to do two things. You need to be able to do wash, and you need to be able to do collaboration. You need to swiftly be able to build partnerships with others, with different others in different contexts. So my simple thought there would be that every organization should stop thinking it's the sun around which the rest of the world orbits and start seeing as itself as a planet orbiting around something much, much bigger than itself. And that, if you like, just shift to recognizing the organization as part of a much bigger and more diverse whole should be, if you like, the attitudinal, the assumptional basis on which everything else is built. So recognizing that nobody's got all of it and that we kind of need groups of organizations to make it happen.